And we're good.
And we are go. Hey, everybody. Greg White and the inimitable Clay Phillips. I think this is the first time Clay has been live.
Yeah. They finally convinced me to get on this camera thing.
He tried to stay backstage. Hey, look, we had a great session yesterday with our stand-up and sound-off broadcast. First of all, thanks to Scott Luton for putting that together. And it was a great session, well mediated, some great topics, outstanding questions, and some industry experts who helped everyone with some of their concerns and questions. We shared some ideas from the audience. It was a great opportunity for people to not only ask questions, but share their ideas. And we had some great ones. We ran out of time because we had so many great ones. And we decided that today we would try to get some of those other questions and I answered and ideas shared. So Scott is probably kicking back in his recliner right now, just watching us. And Clay and I decided that we would take over the studio. So this won't be as buttoned up as you would expect, perhaps, from us. But it's going to answer some of these questions. And forgive me as we go through this, because I am going to be going back through a list of questions over here somewhere and pulling out some of those questions. Clay is going to field your questions if you have additional questions, and we'll try to get to those in just under an hour. Maybe well under an hour, but it won't be any more than that, because as Scott has told me, we have a hard stop. So first of all, I wanted to thank some of the folks that had asked really good questions yesterday and got theirs answered. I'm not going to mention anyone's last name, but I may mention one person's last name, but I may mention their company, and I'm glad to hear from them again as well. So let's just get started. What do you say?
That's good.
All right, here we go. So Adam from Poland, Graphene Partners, Chazanov, I believe is his last name. That's one person. He may think I'm a madman, because yesterday one of the things that we said was, if retailers get overstocked during this crisis, so what? So he clearly took issue with that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. First of all, I think we have to be aware that there are uniquenesses in different markets. There's plenty of open warehouse space here in the States, but in Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe, they're at about 95% capacity. So that was the root of his concern. And I'm glad that, Adam, that you raised it. Thank you. And so I want to address what I meant in context there. So the so what really for a retailer is, let's not worry about optimizing inventory. Of course, you don't want to blow the walls out, but you do want to take as much space as is necessary for especially those hard to get items and those commodities that people are struggling to get hold of. So really the point, if you take out the hyperbole, whatever you want to say, the emphasis is, let's not worry about optimizing our inventory right now. Let's get the inventory into the supply chain. Worry about the mispositioning or overstock or excess of inventory that exists after the fact, or as demand starts to come down. A point well made by Adam is that the whiplash effect up the chain will be substantial. And if anyone's not familiar with the whiplash effect, it's been described a lot of times to any of us in supply chain. The effect of forecast or fulfillment error at the retail or consumer level gets exacerbated as you go up the supply chain all the way back to manufacturing and ultimately sourcing. So we have to be aware of that. We don't want to put our suppliers in jeopardy by being careless at the retail level. But at the same time, again, let's not worry too much about optimization. One of the other things that Adam had concern about is, should we had this discussion yesterday about, should we fundamentally change risk management? So risk management in and of itself, I think, clearly needs some revision, and probably fundamental revision. The greater context of what we were talking about was risk management as it regards the planning and positioning of inventory. And the statement we made yesterday was it doesn't need a foundational change, but what it does need is it needs the ability for us to consider events like this in the portions of supply chain planning and supply chain and fulfillment that are impacted because of events like this. For instance, toilet paper and the excess rush on TP really impacted lead times to and fulfillment capabilities to retail. So when you think about how you mitigate for that risk, you want some backstock for just in case inventory, which is a fairly uniquely retail concept because manufacturers are trying to go very, very lean right now, which means that inventory, safety stock inventory has to be carried at or near the retail node. So we want to make sure that we're accounting for a good portion of the spikes that we could incur, but we can't always fulfill or can't always maintain safety stock for any spike that could occur, because that will break the bank, right? If we have what if inventory for any what if, then that's way too costly for at the retail node. So the argument that we were making around risk management at retail, and particularly as regards inventory planning and inventory management, was let's not get too crazy about thinking that because this crisis happened that we have to have a backstock for the eventuality that this type of crisis could happen again. I think we had an example of a medical supplier who had hurricane provisions as a kind of a central backstock for their entire supply chain, and that's a good example of how to do it. You don't need excess safety stock at every node, but you will need it undoubtedly for the eventuality that this occurs. So you want to determine from a cost benefit standpoint how much you can afford to cover when a spike like this does occur. All right. We also had a question from James at Fraser and Dieter, a tax and accounting firm right here in Atlanta as well. And the question was, coming out of this period of time, do you see a migration of business from China closer to the US, specifically around Central America and Mexico? Not an economist, so I can't speak to specific countries. I can say that I already see from the people that we talk to in the industry a significant theme towards mitigating the risk of single or significant suppliers in your supply chain. So one of the discussions again that we had yesterday was we need to reduce our dependence on China. At the same time, that's a very difficult thing to do because they have the largest workforce in the world. So what we need to address is, sorry, some people are hitting me direct here. So I'm trying to at least knock those away. But anyway, what we need to address is diversifying our sourcing. We can't remain as reliant on China as we are today. For a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is this sort of thing, the power that any single source has over you if they are your single source, and two, obviously the recovery against some of the impact that we've seen on the supply chain has been delayed because the lead times are substantial from China. What we've seen in the distribution and retail trade for a number of years is secondary sourcing opportunities, where you take a percentage of your demand and you keep feeding it to a potential secondary source to keep their lines alive, keep it profitable enough to remain a vendor for you, and then you maintain some additional capacity to ramp up in the interim when a crisis like this hits. So that has been common practice in the distribution and in some retail industries for particular products for decades now. And I think we need to take a serious look at that across the board in supply chain, learn from that example and apply that. I'd love to see the production come back to the Americas, be they Central, South, or North America, or wherever your respective market is, because with the advent of robotics, the possibility to produce at much higher level than you can with labor exists today. In fact, there's an article on CNBC.com where they talk about China is actually rushing to deploy robots because they can't get enough of their workforce back into factories to ramp up production. If they are using robotics, then the advantage of their cheap and plentiful labor force is reduced as well, which means that there is opportunity for countries to do reshoring. Another point that Adam pointed out was that reshoring is an initiative that ought to be undertaken, but you can do reshoring if you have robotics. And there's two reasons that I want to calm everyone who thinks that robotics will take jobs. There are two particular factors that I think we need to consider. One is that the exodus of the baby boomer generation out of the workforce at the rate of around 10,000 per day means that our workforce capacity is reducing in countries where that boom took place. And additionally, it also means that the workforce that is incoming, Gen Y and Gen Z, Gen X, don't say okay boomer.
Yeah, no.
Not a boomer. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but the incoming workforce is much, much more comfortable working with technology, and they don't have the fear that administration or automation is going to take their jobs away. So imagine a scenario where you're able to bring back a good portion of your production and use automation and robotics to be able to mitigate the cost of a massive labor force to replace the labor that exists in China. What it tells me, when only about 1/8 of their workforce was back on the job, 100 million of their 805 million workers, once when you realize those numbers, you can see that there is opportunity to replace even a substantial workforce like theirs with robotics. And again, those are jobs we don't have in the States today. So it could actually accrue to the benefit of employment here in the States. And we just recently got some pretty dramatic, though I think short-term unemployment numbers because of the coronavirus crisis, and because of the fact that we are shuttering businesses, at least temporarily, here in the States. So there's some big upside here.
Some good points from Tom and Jonathan.
Tom Valentine?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Tom, you made it. I'm glad you made it. I was just about to refer to you because one of the points that Tom made yesterday was at least in the States, it's not solely workforce cost or workforce availability that drove production offshore. It's also taxation and regulation schemes by the U.S. government that have driven that somewhat as well. What else does he have to say?
COVID-19 combined with favorable regulation and taxation will bring supply chains to onshore and nearshore. So you kind of
there we go.
Right there.
So Tom is consistent, and thank you. And I'm glad you made it. I saw your note, but we were already live, Tom. So I'm glad you made it.
Jonathan says we actually need the robots to help us do our jobs better and to enable us to focus on more value-added activities. The future is now. So
Jonathan Townsley is in procurement, and robotic process automation is a big part of that industry. And Jonathan has been on the show before and sharing some of the thoughts that he's shared before, that some of the mundane, the repetitive, and deeply analytical tasks can be done better and to the benefit of human beings, because we don't have to do those physically repetitive, potentially dangerous, boring types of tasks that can be handled better by automation as well. So thank you, guys, and thank you for fielding that. let's see, what do we have now? Okay, so from Derek from Trimac Transportation. So in the context of transportation, his statement is, on margins, it's a race to the bottom. We all know the prudent thing is to hold safety stock, but all it takes is one competitor to hold less, and everyone else is forced to follow suit. True. A true statement. If someone's willing to take a greater risk, that's a brand decision as well as a cost decision, because the risk still remains that they could run out of stock and limit their ability to fulfill. And Derek, one of the things I would argue as well, this is my area of expertise. So I've built planning and optimization solutions for a few decades now, let's say around 2 decades now. And so I've experienced this. There are ways to reduce safety stock without increasing risk, and that is by adding to the sophistication of the calculations that you use to determine safety stock. If you take into consideration things like lead time and the reliability of your vendors and of your lead time and your transportation organizations to hit those lead times, that can add to the benefit of safety stock. If you know how variable your demand is, how often you procure goods, all of those things go into a calculation that helps you determine what is the right safety stock. And then you layer over the top of that a service, a first pass fill rate, or a customer experience goal, depending on your industry. It'll be one of those things typically that you want to hit. You can use that calculation to identify, I am willing to take this much risk. For instance, you could say, I am willing to take the risk of missing 1.5% of my usual demand. And that would lower your safety stock burden over being willing only to take the risk of missing, say, 0.5 percentage point of your usual demand. So you can manage that. And then in addition, the cash that you get out of inventory by managing that safety stock very, very scientifically gives you the ability to have these emergency backstops of inventory in a single place without breaking the bank. So there's a lot of discussion that can be had there. At the highest level, that is one way to approach it. And I would suggest that if you aren't approaching safety stock with a very, very scientific approach, there are plenty of opportunities out there to learn about how to do it. I'm glad to provide you with some input there if you're interested in learning a bit more there. So Andrea from Big Blue, IBM, said, have you seen more companies be flexible with their policies to handle current environments? And the answer is yes, in so many areas. So just 2 days ago, it was 2 days ago, correct? Yeah, just 2 days ago, we had Steve Keaveney on the show, who is a finance expert. And what he's seeing and helping companies do is he's seeing a lot of companies relaxing their financing policies, payment policies. I just had a discussion today with someone, and we often talk with Ward Richmond, the supplychainrealestate.com guy. We just had a discussion with him as well about how organizations are forgiving up to 3 months rent right now. In fact, if your landlord is not forgiving or delaying about 3 months rent, I would say that they're behind the curve, because most everybody seems to be falling in line with doing that. And thank you, by the way, to all the landlords and mortgage holders out there for doing that. It's well appreciated and, of course, needed in this time. In addition to that, payment policies, as I said, finance regulations in the US, at least, there is a significant backstop bill that has just been recently passed that's going to provide funds to companies to make payroll over this time when they are essentially shut down. And there are a number of other policies, yes, that we're seeing relaxed. And I hope that Andrea, Big Blue, is also being kind to all of their partners out there. As one of the biggest technology providers out there and service providers, we sure appreciate that. So Raphael had this question, and that is, should the experience and data from the past regarding social conflicts, natural disasters, and other similar pandemic events be taken into consideration for future safety inventory equation? And the answer to that is yes. There, again, you can consider these variables and how they impact the inputs to your safety stock inventory equation. And you need to weight them appropriately. There are all kinds of scientists who I'm sure have opinions on that, but you need to weight the likelihood that these will occur again, and when and if you do determine that they occur, the measure in which that you believe that they occur. If you can identify those things for yourself, your own risk-taking measures, and the capability or the risk that you're willing to take in regard to that first pass fill rate or in-stock rate or customer experience metric, then you'll be able to come up with something that your company can absorb on a day-to-day basis, and that mitigates the risk as much as you are willing and fiscally able to do. So good question there. So Don from Long Insights stated this and asked a question as well. So risk mitigation is something that should be considered at all levels with regard to upstream direct impact and downstream implications of our plans, whether the event is localized or global as the impact of COVID-19. Once this particular pandemic is past, how many businesses will actually attempt going back to business as usual versus strategically developing strategies, incorporating technology, multiple pipelines, and revising processes? I think, unfortunately, way too many will go back to business as usual. And even when companies do incorporate measures to offset the potential impact of something like this, as we've seen, at least in the States, since the Great Recession, where we had a great relaxing of financial requirements to help people get homes, we have slowly, though over the course of 10 years or so, seen that relaxing of requirements start to occur again. And I think that companies may fall out of practice until another one of these sorts of global or local events starts to occur. If, however, you utilize technology to incorporate that into your process, you don't have that same risk. And that's why the question was around leveraging multiple pipelines, revising processes, and incorporating technology. If we start to consider multiple pipelines, or I'm going to call that diversified sourcing, and we automate or systematize that with technology, then our risk becomes much, much lower of falling into bad habits in the future. If a company continues to, and Sarah Barnes Humphrey will probably shake my hand for this, if a company continues to maintain manual processes and uses spreadsheets and other non-traceable methodologies to attack these kind of issues, then they will continue to have these kind of issues, and they will undoubtedly fall out of practice at just about the time that another one of these crises hits. You got anything you want to?
Yeah, so we've got Claudia Freed, who's been our #1 fan since she came on.
Yes, of course.
We've got her. How is COVID impacting container capacity and trucking in the U.S.?
So we saw a big peak in the impact of trucking and container volume requirements, and we're starting to see a tailing off of that. But that I believe that's going to continue to come in fits and starts. I have to confess, I am not a transportation expert. I know what Tom Valentine and Tim Dooner tell me, and what I've seen from Journal of Commerce and some of their analysis. But effectively, what has happened is we saw a great influx of trucking requests, and those are starting to tail off. That is somewhat due to the fact that because businesses, especially in the States, are are effectively shuttering for some period of time, they don't have the same need. And I see a lot of that collection of trucking and container volume being largely around medical and grocery, the typical type of staple supplies. So that's about as much as I can tell you there, but it is definitely having an impact, and it will continue to. Interestingly, shipments are hitting ports in the States from China, where they've ramped up production and shipping at about the time that ports are reducing staff and starting to utilize limited hours. So there will need to be some sort of reconciliation there. And if anybody who knows more about that would like to sound off, we'd love to put your thoughts on the air as well. So you want to go there? Okay. So Pierre from World Logistics Trade Solutions says, following 9/11, security generated a worldwide re-engineering on reporting data for those countries and individuals who, when they come out of the other side of this pandemic, what new security regulatory requirements could we face? From a security standpoint, I can see that there's going to be a need for verification of vendor and also of shipper and purchaser information, because we're seeing some substantial, I wouldn't say that it's rampant, but some substantial subset of fraud at least being attempted in terms of some of the most essential goods like masks and gloves and whatnot. So I think undoubtedly we will see more security there. We talked a little bit today with some folks about how provenance, where the goods came from, and following through them through the supply chain will become more and more important. First of all, that was already an issue because of the consumer's desire to work only with good actors in the supply chain and those who are using sustainable and ethical practice in the supply chain. So we've already seen some accountability in terms of provenance and chain of custody in terms of products. The question was asked yesterday, and again, we discussed in another topic today, blockchain and the part that it plays in that. It definitely does. If you're not familiar with blockchain, think of it as an irrefutable and unchangeable record. When I say you received 100 and you verify it at that moment, that data can never be changed again. And the ability to track and trace who has touched it, what they did with it, and who they handed it off to in the supply chain will become a very, very important factor. It's already headed that way. I think this could accelerate that.
All about traceability.
Yeah, exactly. Traceability is really the key mantra there. So Daniel asks, what do we do when only some links of the chain are disrupted? How do we cover the gaps? That's a tough one. When some of the chains links are disrupted, it depends on what you're talking about. Is it a supply link or is it a transportation link? If a supply link is disrupted, then it depends on where it lands in the supply chain. Again, this is where I would advocate for secondary, alternate, or diversification of sourcing, so you're not dependent on one particular organization for your plastic pellets to make whatever you're making out of that, or for your rolls of yarn for making products, or whatever your source is. You want to make sure that you've got some diversification there. And that's probably the best way to account for it. Unfortunately, if you didn't account for it ahead of time, you might be in a bit of a pickle right now and for a good while. So let's tackle that from a transportation standpoint. I think we're in a fortunate circumstance right now in that there was a glut of transportation availability and capacity prior to this, to the extent that, as we experienced in the last part of 2019, many transportation companies suffered difficulties or even went out of business. So I think that's the availability of assets is not as big of an issue as the availability of human capital to manage those assets. You know, you're going to have to work hard and hustle. I mean, I saw an article from Tim Cook today. When Apple is sourcing for companies masks, that gives you some idea of the disruption that's in the supply chain right now. So we're in exceptional times. There's no one right answer. Hustle, to me, is the key. We've talked to some folks who aren't typically in the sourcing business. Enrique Alvarez, who was on Stand Up and Sound Off yesterday, he didn't mention this on the show yesterday, but they are actually sourcing goods for some of their customers. And then Steve Keaveney mentioned a company called iRemedy yesterday that's an online medical distribution company who is sourcing for some of the largest hospital chains in the country. And they are seeking out new sources in countries that they've not gone to before. So there are some exceptional acts to keep the supply chain going. You still good here? So this is an interesting insight from Simone of Setlog Corp. She agreed with our discussion yesterday and of course today on single sources, but mentioned that it's not only China that is a major exposure, but also India and Bangladesh. I would add Malaysia, depending on the type of products that you are sourcing. I know that I worked with a medical distributor when I started my company along about 15 years ago, just over a decade ago. And we started moving sourcing for gloves and other medical supplies out of China back then because we saw that there were capacity issues. They did have us a bit over a barrel, and we wanted to diversify sourcing so that we wouldn't be caught in a difficult situation from a sourcing standpoint. Well, good to point that out. You have to think about other places than China as potential risks in terms of where the supply chain could break down for you.
Claudia wants to know what this is doing to compliance and if any bad habits are developing.
Compliance, vendor compliance? Oh, she may mean procurement compliance. If we're talking about procurement or vendor compliance, I don't know of any specific instances. I've heard some anecdotal evidence from people who've said they've struggled with both procurement rules compliance and with vendor compliance. DHL invoked force majeure late last week, just recently anyway. You can expect more of that to occur, where force majeure, if you're not familiar, is a contract term wherein the company that you're working with abdicates some of their obligations because of the exceptional circumstances of the times. This pandemic causing business interruption from their standpoint, and therefore disabling them outside of their own control from meeting their obligations. You may see some of that sort of thing invoked. Virtually every contract has a force majeure clause in it. If you are in legal or subject to the legal terms of an agreement, I would suggest you take a look at what are the conditions under which force majeure can be invoked. Again, a non-attorney spokesperson, but having dealt with that fairly frequently, it's worth a look, and then consult your legal resources about that. Cheryl from Garden of Eden, do you see change in sourcing and movement away from China and this is from a totally different perspective, so I really appreciate this perspective, considering that in 2030, their workforce will be smaller based on recent analysis. A lot of that has to do with the fact that for years, it was mostly boy children in China because they had the one child limitation. So I see a change in sourcing away from China for a lot of reasons, some of which I won't mention here, but not the least of which is they are the primary source for so many organizations. This has showed their vulnerability as well as our vulnerability, and just generally the vulnerability of single sourcing. So I think we've hit that topic pretty well. But yeah, I hadn't thought of it in terms of the downturn of workforce. I have thought about how we produce goods in the states, in our respective municipalities and localities and countries, regardless of what that country is, as population decline does occur, and it is, inevitable that by 2050 population decline will be well underway. Also, because of the exiting of the baby boomer generation from the workforce, that's going to reduce the overall size of the workforce. Millennials are now the largest workforce, largest generation in the workforce, and that generation is significantly smaller than the boomers. So we're going to have to get more efficient. It's going to be, I think they're well equipped, by the way, millennials and Gen Z, to adopt what is going to be necessary, which is, as many of us have talked about, more automation and robotics and that sort of thing. I do not fear robot overlords. So Tom from PSI Engineering said, I am eager to learn what others are thinking. It looks like we will be in this crisis for longer than was initially thought last week. I'm interested in what others are thinking as well. I really don't know what the length of this crisis will be. I think the president here in the States has targeted getting back to business, whatever that means, by April 12th. That seems awfully fast, considering that we still haven't in the States. Again, this is the United States is more of a unification of independent governments. So the mandates around shelter in place or stay at home fall to the states in our country. So it's a little bit different than a lot of other countries. But I think we are very nearly universally at shelter in place mandates for the states. So I think it could take a while to know how much impact this health crisis is having on the workforce and whether it continues to grow in the workforce. Those are all the questions that I had from yesterday. Is there anything else?
I don't have anything else.
Anyone else have a question out there? You've got about 5 seconds.
Speak now.
Yeah, to put your questions, comments, arguments, refutations, sea stories, or very clean jokes, dad jokes only, out there, and we'll gladly field it. Let me again thank everyone who participated in Stand Up and Sound Off yesterday. We had over 500 people involved in that yesterday, and I appreciate all of you who've joined us today. I'm glad we got to get to some of those additional questions. We had such a tremendous discussion yesterday. I'm glad that we got to get to everyone's thoughts and questions, even if it took us 2 days to do so. And I hope that some of these answers were helpful to you. I hope that this helps you get through this crisis, to feel comfortable, more comfortable about working at home. Get your feet under you, stay healthy, be kind, and get some work done, and come through this stronger on the other side. I'm a firm believer that there is abundance in the universe, and on the other side of this, I think we will all begin to see that. I am willing to acknowledge reality, but I refuse to be bound by it. Thanks, everybody. Take care. We'll talk again soon.